I made the mistake of thinking that I would have time this summer to film 2 videos a week, and that has turned out not to be the case. But I am here to finish up the questions thread and answer your questions that you've asked me in my community tab. Hi, my name is Sarah, and I make videos about sewing and styling a handmade wardrobe. There were just 3 questions left in the Ask Me Anything thread, and I'm here to answer them right now. Let's just get to the first one. This one is from Jan Franklin. She asks, who inspired you to sew, and what skill did you learn that took your finished makes to the next level? So the first part of this question about who inspired me, I've already answered this in a previous Q&A, so I will link to that one down in the description box. But basically, it was my mom. When I was growing up, she made a lot of my clothes for me when I was a kid, and I watched her sew and I learned from her. Even if I didn't directly learn how to sew clothes, I definitely was surrounded by sewing, and I got a feel for what the process was like. And then eventually in 2005, I decided to start sewing my own clothes. But without her, I probably wouldn't have even known that that was a thing. So she was definitely my inspiration. And then in terms of what helped me to level up my sewing, I would say it was not any one particular thing, but I actually do owe a lot to the Craftsy Unlimited subscription. I had a subscription, I think it was one of those things where I got it for like $1 for like a year, or one of those promotional things. And I think it was probably around 2016, 2017 that I had this subscription, and they had all of these classes available. And at the time, I was actually more of a quilter than a garment sewist. But I really learned a lot by watching a ton of those classes, both on quilting and on making clothes. And so the information that I gained just from watching all those classes, I would almost kind of watch them as like entertainment. Like you would sit down after dinner and watch YouTube. I would sit down and watch a Craftsy class. And this is totally not sponsored. Like I don't even know if Craftsy is still around anymore. But it really did help me learn to level up my sewing and my quilting a lot. So I do owe a lot to that subscription. And a lot of those skills that I learned at the time, I still use them today. So thank you so much for the question, Jan, and now let's move on to the next one. This question is from Nancy Scober. Which indie pattern companies have the best instructions for finishing a garment? I can sew things together and think that I know the alterations I need to do, but always seem to not know how to do the last bits. Any advice? So there's a lot of indie pattern companies out there that I think have really good finishing instructions, but there's kind of levels here. There's the first level that I would consider to be very good, adequate, basic finishing instructions. And then there's the companies that give you more what I would consider couture level techniques. So in the first category, what I would consider like basic and totally adequate, there are pattern companies like Helen's Closet, True Bias, Itch to Stitch, Chalk and Notch, Closet Core. I'm sure there's many others. I feel like they all have really good basic finishing instructions. Like as you're going along, it'll say, like sew this seam and then finish the seams. They don't just expect you to know when to finish seams on your own, which is something that I would say that the Big Four really doesn't do. Pattern Emporium is another one. The instructions are nice and clear, but they're not necessarily too overly hand-holdy in my opinion. Now in the second category, if you want to take your finishing to another level, which by the way, I feel like I should just say that I am not a stickler for finishing. Like some garments I care about it a lot, and some garments I don't care about it at all. For me, most of the time, just doing serging is perfectly adequate for my needs. I don't really care that much about having the inside of my garment being as beautiful as the outside, so maybe I'm not the best person to ask. But that's kind of my context, my perspective of where I'm coming from. The companies that I think go above and beyond and give you a lot more detail are companies like Vicky Sews or Grasser. In my mind, they almost take it to a level that's too much for my opinion. Like Vicky Sews will often have you put like stabilizing tape around collars and just do all these like really complicated finishing steps that in my mind is a little bit of overkill. Like I don't necessarily want to invest that much time in a garment. But if you really want to do things the right way, I would say that both of them have really very, very thorough instructions of how to get the best finishing techniques. I haven't actually made it yet, but I even had a skirt pattern from Vicky Sews that was meant to be made out of faux leather, but they instruct you on how to sew the seams and then actually glue them down so that they stay in place. And the skirt was also fully lined, so all of those seams would be hidden inside the garment. And to me, like, that's just too much for me. Like, I don't actually want to do all that stuff. But if you're into that, I would definitely recommend checking out those companies for that level of detail. Also, I would recommend just maybe getting a book on finishing techniques. Like I said, I don't really care that much, so I don't necessarily have any books to recommend to you, but I know that they are out there. So I'm going to ask you guys in the comments if you're more into the specialty like couture finishing. Please let us know if there's any books that you recommend or any resources. For my part, I will just be happy with a serged seam the majority of the time, unless it's something special, and then I might take a little bit more time. But I'm probably never going to be super into doing a lot of things by hand because that's just not my jam. But I do hope that this was helpful to you in some way, and I'm sure that people in the comments will give you a lot of really good suggestions. Now, this last question from Twyla Osterkamp is kind of the reason why this particular video got so delayed. I had all these intentions of setting up the camera and doing like a demonstration, but I just don't have time for that. And if I wait until I have the time, I'm never going to film this video. So I'm just going to read the question. I'm going to answer it to the best of my ability. And then I will recommend some channels down in the description box that are specifically about pattern alterations and making fitting adjustments, and just recommend you to them because I'm sure that they will give you way better advice than what I could say. But the question is, can you please explain or show us petite women how to choose a pattern that isn't going to make us look shorter, or how to adjust it so the waist hits in the correct spot? I guess my question is how to shorten a garment that is too long-waisted. Now, the first part of the question to me is a little bit of a landmine because if you ask for my opinion, I'm just going to tell you that there is nothing on this earth that is going to make a short woman look taller, and that's just reality. I know there's a ton of marketing advice and videos out there that will tell you how to look taller if you're petite, and I'm not saying that their advice is wrong or that you shouldn't follow it, but I think that it's just all sort of relative. Like, you can follow all the rules, you can wear sky-high heels, but it's only going to work up to a point. I'm 4'9". Nothing in the world that I could put on my body is going to fool people into thinking that I'm tall, because I'm just not. So for me in my life, it's just not even a goal that I'm trying to achieve anymore, trying to look taller. I just wear what I like and what makes me happy, and just having things that fit my body correctly. And I feel like that's how I look my best, rather than trying to fool people into thinking that I'm something that I'm not. Now, in terms of the second part of your question on how to alter the waistline on a pattern, this is where I'm going to just stand up and show you and try to do my best, but you should really check out the other resources that I'm going to put in the description box. Okay, I have a pattern piece in my hand here for a top. I have done a small bust adjustment on it. That's not super important. I just wanted to explain that to you. And on Big Four patterns, they do actually usually mark where the waistline is supposed to be. But if you have a pattern that doesn't have the waistline marked, the easiest way is just to look at wherever the narrowest point is and draw a horizontal line and call that the waistline. Now, another important thing to say is that I'm showing you this on a pattern piece, but you really should make a muslin in fabric, because fabric sits on your body differently than a pattern piece does. And so if you just alter the pattern piece without making it in fabric, you might actually get it a little bit wrong. So I do highly encourage you to actually make a muslin in fabric, try it on, and then make your alterations, but just for demonstration purposes. So when we're talking about moving a waistline, whether you are long-waisted or short-waisted, basically the objective is to get the waistline on the pattern to sit where your actual waist is. If you're not familiar with how to find your waist, if you just bend over at the side and you see where you naturally bend, that's generally where your waist is. Now, this is a relatively simple idea, but it can get complicated, which is another reason why it's taken me so long to do this video. So in a vacuum, you simply want to move wherever the waist is on the pattern to where the waist is on your actual body. However, the reason I say that it can get complicated is because it depends on your individual proportions. So let's say that I have my pattern piece here and I can see like where the waistline is. And in Big Four patterns, typically the waist generally is in the correct location for my particular body. Again, I might be like not holding this perfectly correctly, but generally speaking, I think that you can see that the waistline of the pattern is where it's supposed to be. However, the reason why I'm saying it gets complicated is because we can be short and long in different places on our bodies. So for me, sometimes, and not always, I'm actually a little bit short from my shoulders to my bust line. So things like straps might fall off, or necklines might be too deep, or armholes might be too low. And so sometimes, not on all patterns, I find that I need to make an adjustment and actually shorten a little bit above the chest in order to make this area here fit me correctly. However, when I make that adjustment, let's pretend that I took ½ inch out above the chest and I've made that a little bit shorter, then that's actually going to bring up the waistline as well. But the waistline for on me originally was in the right spot. So I would need to shorten it half an inch here, but then below the chest, I would have to lengthen it that half an inch in order to get the waistline in the correct spot. And the same is true for the hem. If we're talking about a dress bodice where it cuts off at the waist, then you won't really need to make further alterations. But in this case, it's a top. And so if I move the location of the waistline, let's say that I'm short-waisted and I had to move it up like 1.5 inches, then if I just leave it that way, then the top's going to be 1.5 inches shorter. And that might be shorter than I actually want it if I want to tuck the top in. And so I might actually need to add that 1.5 inches back below the waist so that the overall length of the top is the same. So that's why I'm saying it's slightly more complicated than just moving the waist where you need it to be, because you might need to make further alterations depending on your own body proportions. But the concept is relatively a simple one. You just want to take the pattern waistline wherever it is and move it up or down so that it matches your own body proportions. And you always want to start from the top down. So if you need to make an alteration from your neckline down to your chest, you do that before you alter the waistline, because everything is going to be affected depending on where you start at the top. I hope that that makes sense. The other wrinkle into this, which makes it even a little bit more complicated, is if you need to do a bust adjustment. So in my case, I have a small chest. I often need to do a small bust adjustment. That's actually going to remove total length from the garment because I need less fabric to go over the curve of my chest. That's going to make it shorter. However, like I said, most of the time the waistline of the original pattern is in the right spot. So if I do a small bust adjustment, I often have to add the length that I took out from the chest and put it back below the chest so that the waistline is still in the correct location. So everything's kind of interrelated. When you make different length adjustments, you might have to alter more than one thing. So keep that in mind. But usually the way to diagnose if you need these kinds of adjustments is to try on the clothes that you've already made in the past that maybe don't fit that well, or try on ready-to-wear garments and see if there's any consistencies. Like, do you notice that the waistline is always like an inch too low for you? Well, then you probably need to make an adjustment and move it up an inch, but keep in mind that you want to check all of those other things to make sure that they're also matching your natural body proportions. I have no idea if that helped you at all. I really hope that it did. Like I said, I am going to be linking some channels that are exclusively about fitting adjustments, and I encourage you to check them out. They're really good teachers, which I am definitely not. But hopefully it gives you a little bit of a starting point. Thank you so much for asking the question. And that is actually going to wrap it up for me. Thank you so much to everybody who asked me a question. I think I have covered them all now. And I'll be back next week with another video.